They promised rebirth but delivered ruin. In the heart of Europe, a shattered nation emerged from the wreckage of one war only to plunge the world into another, more violent, more mechanized, more apocalyptic than anything mankind had yet witnessed. But how does a country teetering on the brink of economic extinction, its currency worth less than toilet paper, its government dismissed as a puppet, and its people broken in body and spirit rise, in barely a decade, to threaten the entire planet? This is the paradox of Nazi Germany, a regime that revived a dying economy only to make it the engine of destruction, a false miracle, a house of cards built on deception, propaganda, and war. And beneath it all, a question that still haunts us. Can an economy truly prosper when it is built not to sustain life, but to wage death? November 1918. The guns of the Great War fall silent, but for Germany, there is no peace, only humiliation. The Kaiser abdicates, leaving behind a throne and an empire in collapse. From the ashes rises the Weimar Republic, a new democratic government, born not in triumph, but in shame. The victors of the war gather at Versailles, and in 1919, they present Germany with a treaty that feels more like a sentence. Reparations, territorial losses, military restrictions, and worst of all, blame. Article 231 of the treaty brands Germany the sole aggressor of the war, and the psychological blow it delivers is almost as brutal as the economic one. Proud veterans and starving citizens alike cry betrayal. A myth is born, the stab in the back, that would poison German politics for decades. To meet the impossible reparation payments, the new republic does the unthinkable. It prints money. By 1923, a loaf of bread costs over 200 billion marks. Children build castles with stacks of worthless currency. Workers are paid twice a day just to buy groceries before prices rise again. Inflation doesn't just damage the economy, it destroys trust. And when trust dies, extremism thrives. Into this vacuum of faith and function steps a new party. Nationalist, racial, radical. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, led by an Austrian veteran with a mustache and a messiah complex, Adolf Hitler. But in 1924, a brief reprieve comes. The Dawes Plan, backed by American loans, stabilizes the mark and restarts industry. A new currency, the Rentenmark, restores some sanity. For 5 years, Weimar Germany breathes, recovers, and even flourishes in places. But it is a fragile peace. Then, 1929, the American stock market crashes, and with it, Germany's house of cards collapses once more. Unemployment soars past 6 million. Breadlines return. The center cannot hold. And as always, when desperation rises, so too does the call for strong men. By 1932, the Nazis are the largest party in the Reichstag, but they are not yet in power. Conservative elites, fearing communism more than fascism, hatch a fatal plan, use Hitler to neutralize the radicals. On the 30th of January, 1933, Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, the Reichstag is burning, civil liberties are suspended, and democracy breathes its last. The Weimar Republic, flawed but free, is dead. In its place rises the Third Reich. Germany in 1933 was a nation disillusioned with democracy and obsessed with revival. Hitler didn't simply promise prosperity, he promised greatness. He tapped into ancient grievances and painted a vision of a racially purified utopia where Germans would no longer crawl before foreign bankers or bow under Versailles. But rhetoric alone could not build a Reich. What Hitler needed urgently was legitimacy. And in the eyes of millions, legitimacy meant jobs. The numbers tell a story the world wanted to believe. In 1932, over 30% of the German workforce was unemployed. By 1935, official numbers claimed unemployment had dropped to under 2 million. A miracle. Or so it seemed. But this miracle was a mirage, constructed through manipulation, exclusion, and repression. The Nazis didn't just reduce joblessness, they redefined it. Women who left the workforce to raise children, incentivized by generous marriage loans, were no longer counted as unemployed. Part-time workers were classified as full-time. Jews forced out of their professions were erased from the statistics. Prisoners and forced laborers were counted as if they had gained employment when in fact they had lost their freedom. The truth was darker. In many ways, the Nazi economic recovery was built on a lie, but a lie repeated often enough can become a foundation for power. Hitler understood that perception was more valuable than precision, and with Joseph Goebbels by his side, he wielded the machinery of propaganda like a weapon. Still, it wasn't all smoke and mirrors. Massive public works projects did put Germans to work, the most iconic being the autobahn, a high-speed highway system that became a symbol of Nazi modernity. But even this, beneath its smooth asphalt and sweeping bridges, was a tool of militarization. Hitler envisioned it not for the leisurely Sunday drives of the average citizen who still couldn't afford a car, but for the swift deployment of panzers across the continent. The proposed solution to low car ownership? The Volkswagen, the people's car. For just 5 marks a week, working Germans could save for their own shiny symbol of national pride. Nearly 340,000 people signed up, but not a single car was ever delivered. Every pfennig was redirected to fund rearmament. The Third Reich was not building an economy to sustain its people. It was building an engine for war. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the industrial sector. Factories that once produced tools and farm equipment were converted secretly at first to manufacture guns, tanks, and aircraft. By 1935, Hitler openly defied the Treaty of Versailles, introducing conscription and boasting an army of over 800,000 men, 8 times the legal limit. To foreign powers, Germany insisted these were agricultural tractors or civilian planes. In reality, they were the early divisions of the Wehrmacht. International protest was minimal. Britain, France, and others, still reeling from the trauma of the Great War, preferred appeasement over confrontation. They watched the storm clouds gather and chose to look away. Internally, the regime turned to an ingenious and dangerous financial instrument to fuel its ambitions: the Mefo bills. These were essentially invisible money promissory notes issued by a dummy corporation, used to secretly fund arms production. It was a form of deficit spending so convoluted that even many German officials didn't fully understand how it worked, but it worked for a time. The military expanded, industry surged, and the illusion of recovery solidified. But illusions demand a terrible price. By 1938, Germany's economy was already beginning to buckle under the weight of its own deception. The nation was running out of raw materials. Imports were down, reserves were thin, and consumer goods were scarce. Every ounce of steel, every trainload of coal, every drop of oil was diverted toward rearmament. The Nazis weren't planning for a future of peace. They were preparing for a future of conquest. The economy, like a shark, had to keep moving or die. And so Hitler looked outward, toward Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, not just for ideological reasons, but because the regime needed to seize wealth, land, and labor to survive. The economic machine of the Reich was not sustainable. It was a ticking clock, and war was the only thing that could keep it running. When Hitler marched into the Rhineland in 1936, violating the Treaty of Versailles, the German army carried rifles, but also hopes. Not hopes for peace, but for redemption through dominance. The economy that had once gasped for breath now marched in lockstep, fueled not by innovation, but by ideology, debt, and an unquenchable thirst for expansion. By the time World War II erupted in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, Germany had transformed into a war machine. Its gross national product had soared to over 100 billion Reichsmarks, nearly doubling from just 7 years prior. Industrial output reached levels not seen since the days of the Kaiser, but this resurrection came at a cost measured not only in currency, but in blood, conscience, and humanity. Much of this growth was built to top the backs of the forgotten and the expendable. As the war raged on, the Reich turned increasingly to slave labor. Over 12 million forced laborers, Poles, Soviets, Jews, and others were dragged into factories, mines, and farms to sustain the illusion of economic stability. These people were not counted in economic reports. Their suffering was not included in the triumphant figures trumpeted by Nazi officials. but they were the true fuel of the Reich's machine. Even within Germany, the common citizen felt the contradictions. Consumer goods were scarce. Rationing became common. While the propaganda reels showed parades and proud soldiers, the average German family struggled to find coffee, butter, or shoes. The promised Volkswagen remained a fantasy. The highways were empty. And yet, many remain loyal. Why? Because the Nazi economy was never designed to provide comfort. It was designed to provide victory. And for a time, it appeared to be succeeding. Poland fell, France fell. The Wehrmacht rolled across Europe, and with every conquest came loot, gold reserves, art collections, industrial assets, entire nations stripped of wealth to finance the war. But this model, too, was unsustainable. Conquest is a short-term solution. What happens when you run out of nations to plunder? By 1942, even at the height of German military power, cracks were showing. The Mefo bill system had collapsed. Inflation began to creep again. Desperate for raw materials, the Nazis turned to increasingly brutal forms of exploitation, mass expropriation, forced deportations, and extermination. The economic motives behind the Holocaust are often overlooked, but they were very real. Jewish-owned businesses were seized and redistributed, properties confiscated, wealth stolen, and those who perished in camps were often worked to death first, their final labor serving the war effort of a regime that had long since abandoned any moral boundary. In the end, the Nazi economy devoured itself. Germany entered the war stronger than it had been in decades, but not because of sustainable policy or financial discipline. It entered because it had gambled everything on a war it could not afford to lose. And when the tide turned, when the Allied bombs rained down, when the Eastern Front collapsed, when the factories were reduced to rubble, there was nothing left. By 1945, the Reich lay in ruins. Cities like Dresden, Berlin, and Hamburg were scorched husks. The once mighty economy was shattered, infrastructure destroyed, currency worthless. The same patterns that defined the 1920s returned, but now, magnified by genocide and total war. Germany had not only failed to escape its post-World War I trauma, it had doubled it. And yet, the legacy remained. In post-war Europe, the question echoed, how could such a rise have happened so quickly? How could a nation on its knees in 1923 stand tall by 1939, only to fall harder than ever before? The answers are not simple, because the Nazi economy was not simply a story of inflation and recovery. It was a story of what happens when economics becomes a tool of tyranny. When the goal is not prosperity, but control. When numbers are used not to measure progress, but to disguise oppression. And when truth like money is printed until it loses all value. In the end, Germany's so-called economic miracle was neither miraculous nor sustainable. It was a high-speed collision between ambition and delusion, hidden beneath the polished veneer of marching columns, national flags, and hollow statistics. But perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this. It worked for a time. It worked just long enough to convince a broken people that a savior had arrived. Long enough to rebuild shattered cities, to silence opposition, to wage war, and to unleash horrors that no economy, no state, no civilization should ever be allowed to forget. The Nazi regime demonstrated with terrifying clarity how a government can manipulate perception not just of its people, but of its enemies. It revealed how job creation can be built on the erasure of human beings, how infrastructure can be weaponized, and how prosperity can be promised without ever intending to deliver it. More importantly, it showed how fragile modern economies truly are, how easily they can be transformed into engines of destruction when corrupted by ideology, fear, and unchecked power. In a world still governed by markets, currencies, and central banks, this lesson has never been more relevant. Because while Hitler's Reich collapsed in flames, the mechanisms it abused, deficit spending, propaganda-driven statistics, state-directed industry, still exist. They are tools. And like all tools, they can build or they can destroy. The story of Nazi Germany's economy is not just a history, it is a warning that even the most advanced industrial state can sell its soul for a temporary illusion, a warning that the pursuit of power, dressed in the language of recovery and reform, can disguise the darkest of intentions, and a warning that behind every miracle, we must look for the cost. Because history does not just echo, it warns, and we would be wise to listen. Nanti. Thank you for watching this episode of Legacy Files. If this deep dive into the rise and fall of Nazi Germany's economy gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we unpack the forgotten moments that shaped our world and trace the legacies they leave behind. Until next time, stay curious and stay watchful.